Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Today we want to talk about the brand new Terramaster F4-424 Pro. Arguably the most confident product by the brand I have ever seen. In more than a decade of this brand being around and the time I've spoken about Terramaster here on the channel, I think it would be fair to say that through the bulk of that time, we've kind of viewed Terramaster as the cheap model, as the cost-effective model, as the one where the money's a bit tight model. But of all the solutions I've ever talked about from Terramaster, comparing them against the likes of Synology, the likes of QNAP, the likes of Asustor, every time I've ever compared them, it's always been from that position of value, whereas this one is probably one of the most prosumer boxes they've ever released. But moreover, going into right at the top end, the beginning of 2024, when this year may well see refreshes of very popular series from the mainstream NAS brands, Terramaster have got ahead of the pack and probably rolled out the most confident solution they ever have, arriving with a new Intel i3 N300 8-core CPU and arriving with 32 gig of memory out of the gate, and all of that combined with this solution rocking with 2.5 GBE and a brand new chassis design and additional storage inside. But before we get too big for our boots, let's slow down a little bit. We've got a system here. First and foremost, the unboxing. I've already taken it out of the box. It arrived in a very bland brown box there. Arrived with our box of accessories there inside. Inside, that's the bag the system arrived in inside the box. We've also got an external PSU, a 90 watt external PSU. Quite, 90 watts is quite big given this doesn't have any kind of PCIe upgradability to it, but still that CPU is powerful than your average day-to-day Celeron, so more powerful than that, so I can kind of see the logic behind it, and it is a 4-bay solution, but I do think this 90 watt PSU is a little bit overkill there, and again, it is an external PSU, fairly generic there, and it leads into a 2-pin connector rather than a 3. There's also your mains cable there inside. You've also got screws for 2.5 inch, 3.5 inch media. You've got information on the first time setup. You've got information on your warranty. The system arrives with 2 years of warranty and weird stickers for your drives that I've never understood. Now, that aside, the unit itself is of course included there, and the chassis design has changed over that of previous Terramaster units that have come before it. But I will say straight away, you can definitely see some influences there on that design, right? I'm not suggesting by any regard that this NAS is trying to be designed to look a little bit like the QNAP and the Synology NAS units, 4 bays from QNAP and Synology respectively, but I think we can all agree there's definitely some comparison to be made there in terms of design, right? The new chassis design of the 424 Pro is black matte effect black plastic all the way around. It's got the ventilated side panel either side that Terramaster have put their own logo on. Again, very similar to what we saw from Synology there. There isn't a removable front panel, but they've gone for a curved edge design here on the front for this 4-bay. There's no LCD panel, but each of these trays has got an LED light indicating their health. Removing trays, they are kind of spring-loaded there at the top, although they are not lockable trays. Each of the individual trays there have got screw holes for 2.5 inch media, and 3.5 inch media can be clipped in via those side connectors on each of the trays. And indeed, if we remove each of those trays, we can take a good little look inside that main storage area. I've already installed a couple of drives for our software testing later on. And inside we can see lovely, tight, clean, combined SATA and data connectors all the way through to the back, and lots of ventilation in those runners for each of those individual trays there. On the side panel there, you can make out LEDs for the power and each of the SATA connected drives there, and the base of the system has further ventilation there. Now, alongside, and we'll go into more detail on this later on, alongside the main SATA base here, there's also 2 M.2 NVMe slots inside. Those can be utilised for SSD caching, but also for individual storage pools. Each of the hard drive bays there supports up to the very latest 22 TB drives. They support the Seagates, the WDs, the Toshibas, etc, etc. And the M.2 NVMe bays you can utilise with pretty much any brand in order to use them definitively as storage pools on this. In terms of noise, the system, Terramaster, they report alongside power consumption of 33 watts over 13 watts active and passive respectively. In terms of noise, they had it reported at 21.0 dBA, with the system fully populated with Seagate Iron Wall 4 TB standard class NAS drives inside there. So reasonable numbers, I would say, for a system and a chassis of this size. Obviously, when things are active or you're using more aggressive or larger hard drives, things are going to scale up. But at the very least, not only have you got the ability to add individual storage pools or graduate your storage generally and a little bit drive by drive, but on top of that, you've got support of T-RAID, their own alternative to flexible storage RAID systems like Synology Hybrid RAID and Drobo Beyond RAID. That means that although, as you can see here, I've got a couple of 8 TB drives inside this system, I can go ahead and install a couple of 20 TBs along the way, and unlike a normal traditional RAID configuration that would limit me to the same capacity of drives all the way across, this allows me to mix and match the drives that I'm going to put inside, and therefore allow me to take advantage of larger capacities as cheaper, larger drives become available. In terms of noise, for the rear fan, we've got that rear fan there and there, and it is one singular large fan. There isn't any internal cooling systems there, and we did have the system running for the software section of the video that you'll see later on, and the Plex testing we've got in a follow-up video. Noise was pretty darn good on this, unlike the chassis that came before it, which, if we remove those away, has looked somewhat dated in recent years. I think this new chassis has got a good bit of life to it, and I think it's a nice look overall. Indeed, another thing about the design of this case over its predecessors, and when I say predecessors, I mean every single Terramaster desktop NAS. One of the pains of Terramaster NASs I've talked about before is getting to the internal components. It's never been that straightforward, and every time you try to get into it, you have to effectively take more than half the chassis apart just to vaguely get to the components. This is something that Terramaster have clearly heard a lot, because now, much like their competitors, you simply need to remove that side panel. It's held in place with 2 screws, and now we can access everything. We can access those 2 M2 NVMEs, the architecture of which we're going to check later in the video. You can access that SODIMM slot there for our DDR5 memory. There's a 32 gig memory module in there, a 32 gig DDR5 SODIMM model there, pretty darn good. Non-ECC, of course, the CPU doesn't support ECC, but still nonetheless nice to have it there. And underneath, we can make out the CPU fan there, dissipating all of that heat from that CPU. Ultimately, I really like the design choices that have gone into this casing. Let's talk about the ports and connectivity of this device, because I do think that is something we have to discuss. So straight away, as impressed as I am about the CPU, more on that later on, the amount of memory that's rolled in with this, the M2 NVMEs and main storage base there, the brand new chassis design that genuinely feels a much higher quality product than the systems that came before it. The ports on this Pro Series box are what really disappoint me a little bit. Now, if you look at them at a casual glance, they're pretty darn good, if I'm honest. Straight away, we've got 2 times 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports that are on the rear, so we can take advantage of 279 megabytes per second potential throughput on each of those, but also lag them together, SMB multi-channel, link aggregation, port trunking, whichever, load balancing, whichever one you want to use. So network connectivity on this is, good as a standard mark. On top of that, you've got a couple of USB 3.2 Gen 2 connections there, so 10 gigabits per second over a USB-C and a USB Type-A, and of course, there are USB adapters that you can get that will allow you to take advantage of Wi-Fi 6. You can take advantage of USB to multiple network interface port connectivity there. You can even take advantage of, thought I lost it there, 2.5G to USB and 5GBE to USB connectivity are supported on this device. So why have I got something of a feeling about the ports and connectivity? Well, because this is the Pro Series box. There is an F2-424, an F4-424, and the F4-424 Pro, and all of them arrive with the same connectivity of 2.5 GBE times 2 there. Now, on the Pro Series box, and particularly given the price point of this, depending on your currency and place in the world, is going to be, at least at launch, between $599 and $699. I would expect 10 gigabit Ethernet for this device. I would expect either get rid of both of those and give me one 10G, or a 10G and a single 2.5G, or even a 10G and a 1G port there. The hardware inside this, and network connectivity and the storage capabilities of this, whether you're going to be using, supported AES encryption, whether you're going to be taking advantage of, widespread synchronization and backup between different devices on a local area network. For the Pro Series box and the hardware I've got here, 2x2.5 GPE is bottlenecking me somewhat. Equally, another recurring thing on Terramaster devices that worth touching on is the inclusion of the HDMI 2.1B port here. So that's great. HDMI 2.1 giving me 4K at 60 frames per second and better bandwidth control than traditional HDMI 2.0. But still, nonetheless, Terramaster is still yet to roll out any kind of graphical user interface for usage with that. So unlike, say, a QNAP that has an HDMI output, or an Asustor that has an HDMI output, they give you that because there's also a parallel running graphical user interface that's accessible via the HDMI port that doesn't just mirror the internal OS, but allows you to watch multimedia from the comfort of your sofa, check your surveillance footage, run a contained application, run a virtual machine, run Kodi, run Plex, all of those things. Whereas the HDMI output on this only gives you local command line output there. Now, if you want, you can assign certain containerized applications to take advantage of some third-party elements of the hardware on this. Indeed, if you want to install TrueNAS on this, or Unraid on this, or other third-party OS softwares, the OS on this is injected and bootloaded from a USB inside, so it's very easy to put TrueNAS or Unraid on this, and it's something that Terramaster, although they don't willingly recommend, they don't mind if you do it with your hardware. But it just bugs me that I've got this HDMI output and I can't really make the most of it. The port and connectivity on this at a glance are fine, but the lack of 10 GPE on this Pro Series model I think is a real mistake by the brand when they're differentiating this Pro and non-Pro series. Another thing, do you see a USB port here on the front? No, I think a USB front-mounted port on this is sorely overlooked, and the idea I can only access them there from the rear, especially the USB Type-C port on the rear, which for convenience would have been great there on the front. It's just little tiny ports and connection choices on this that do rough up my feathers in a bit. And although the majority of them are fine, and I get why they're not going to invest in an HDMI output GUI, you want to see demand before you do that. I will say the lack of 10 GB on this is something of a kick to the nadgers. But next up, let's get ourselves a screwdriver and talk a little bit more about the internal hardware on this device. Now, returning back to that subject of the internal hardware there, let's talk a little bit about that CPU and memory. Now, starting with that CPU, again, it is an i3. I believe this might be the first i3 device that Terramaster have ever rolled out. Now, this is the N300 series, so it's the new Alder Lake family of processors ever since Intel kind of eradicated Celeron and Pentium series and changed it into new N numbers there. This is still an i3 model. It is 8-core, 8-thread architecture with a CPU clock speed of 1.8 GHz that can be burst up to 3.8 GHz. Now, it's a Gen 3 architecture, also with integrated graphics up to 1.25, maximum integrated graphics there with that N series. And again, although we've not published it yet, we have done full Plex testing on this, and this thing could actually handle 8K. Really, it was our client devices during the Plex testing that couldn't handle it. There is some good hardware on this, and probably the best examples of Terramaster actually harnessing the hardware underneath the bonnet there. Still, nonetheless, the N300 does not have all the lanes in the world, and I fully anticipate that those PCIEs are either going to be ×1 or ×2 each, but more on that later on. Now, that CPU, I've got good news and I've got bad. The good news is, of course, that thanks to it being 8-core, 8-thread, there's a lot of resources to chuck at your individual applications, which we'll talk about more on TOS in just a moment. But at the very least, it means that if you are someone that's going to be looking at a home lab for containers or VMs, this is going to do a damn fine job with a lot of resources at your disposal, albeit whether you're going to use TOS or your own third-party OS. But returning to the subject of that memory module, I do think there's an elephant in the room that we need to discuss. Now, the inclusion of a 32 gig DDR5 SODIMM module, that's a bold move by the brand, okay? Frankly, because 32 gig is a lot. Although I moaned about this device not having 10 GB out the gate, the fact that it's arriving with 32 gig of memory at least shows that you're going to have a lot of sandboxy playroom resources to play with. However, that CPU officially supports up to 16 gig. This is twice the official Intel supported memory for this device. And remember, this isn't across two SODIMMs either. This is a single SODIMM slot here that's being occupied by that 32 gig module. Now, I'm not suggesting that this cannot take advantage of that 32 gig. I'd have to really dig deep to find that out. And Terramaster themselves do state that with this system, as long as you use their modules, their system will be able to take advantage of 32 gig of memory inside this. But still, nonetheless, that does question marks in me when I'm running a CPU that the official manufacturers of that processor say caps out at 16 gig for stability, and they will include 32. So on the one hand, I feel good that there's 32 gig in there, that DDR5 SODIMM, but at the same time, I do wonder about the capabilities of how much of that I can use effectively. That CPU, I can't fault. It is up to date, it is server class, it has a great TDP at 7 watts, although it can be adjusted within BIOS. I'm not sure how much of that will be locked away with the Terramaster setup. It has fantastic integrated graphics, and as mentioned, we have pushed it in flexible things exceedingly well up to 8K. We even had 7 instances of our heaviest 200 and 400 megabit per second 4K HEVC file, and this could handle it at once, which for a 599699 NAS is pretty darn good. But that's enough talking about the hardware, the architecture, the ports and connectivity. Let's get this device set up and dig into TOS on this device. Those of you that have ever used the Terramaster NAS will be very familiar with this login screen. It's not changed too much in previous revisions of the Terramaster NAS software accessible via the web browser, but I will say things have certainly been tightened up and they're a great deal speedier as well. Now, I will add that this part of the review, I'm going to skim over a lot of the features and capabilities of the device for a couple of reasons. Number one being I've actually already done a pretty substantial review, almost an hour long, of TOS. It was version 5, and although this system runs on TOS 5.1, a lot of those updates are on individual apps that I'm going to show you, but also some of the responsiveness, so you're going to see that throughout the course of the video. Additionally, Terramaster is currently in the process of rolling out a beta of TOS 6, the latest revision of their software that has got lots of other background improvements and indeed foreground improvements as well. So what I'm going to be doing is rolling out a massive review of TOS 6 when it's fully established, but I'm going to do a 5x5 on the TOS 5.1 review as well. So rather than double down on that and give you guys the same content twice, I'm going to kind of separate it into the dedicated stuff for the F4-424 Pro here for some of the highlights, and then go into a depthier review on a separate video. But again, you can check out the TOS 6 preview if you've already got a Terramaster and you want to try that out. Or you can check out the link to the full TOS review for more information about how the software works on this, and additionally how it compares to the likes of Synology and QNAP a lot. But focusing a great deal more on the F4-424, I will say this is probably the smoothest experience I've ever had with TOS so far. I won't say that it is seamless, and you'll see that throughout the course of the video. I'm going to actually intentionally do some of the things that I think they can improve upon several times throughout the video. But I will say, on the whole, this is the best that I've ever seen from this software from them. Now, that stems across several different areas. The App Center has never been, more populated, and by that I don't just mean they've chucked on a lot of third-party apps and tools. I would say that of the 62 applications that are inside their App Center, I would say 2/3 of them are legit good releases there, and there's some good first-party stuff as well. Everything from improvements with the backup tools, not only for OS-level backups of your local Windows system, for example, that you want to send to the system, but on top of that, cloud synchronization and a multi-tiered backup solution have all now been rolled in to this system. Deduplication, a lot more of the integrity checks, not just snapshots, of course, something we have already installed on this device, but a lot of that internal management of your data inside off-site and in-system to different locations, from USB to real-time remote replication, has all kind of been a great deal more fleshed out from what we're seeing here. A lot of those applications, there's still some third-party ones out there. Some of the third-party ones I would argue are less welcome. For example, virtualization, I'm still not a huge fan of them not having their own VM hypervisor tool and overly reliant on VirtualBox, which in itself is a very good app, but that for a lot of users is such an integral app that having that as a third-party app I know isn't going to be for everyone. But VirtualBox is still a good app. Nonetheless, it's just, that's one of those apps I'd like to see their own first-party option. Things like Plex, I think a lot of users are going to be more than happy to roll with the punches on Plex Media Server, and I will say that Plex runs on this absolutely fine. So if you're looking at this NAS and you're wondering about Plex performance, I'll tell you right now as I turn my volume down. For example, if you wanted to look at this file here, this is a 4K H.265 file here, playing in original quality there, playing absolutely fine, running no slowdown whatsoever. Obviously this is on the local area network, but it's playing that file fine. And if we go for an H.265 or an HEVC file there, open that up, we're running a conversion. It's converting that 4K file. It is utilizing the integrated graphics of that CPU, and this 60 megabits per second HEVC 4K file, a hugely dominating massive file, is playing like a dream. So as I say, Plex Media Server, will be doing a dedicated Plex Media Server test on this video, on this NAS soon, but I just wanted to highlight that it does run great on this. Apart from that, the range of applications and services are still pretty darn good. We've now got their own integrated iSCSI manager, we've got our own integrated AI photo recognition tool, and even their own surveillance app, which is still, I would argue, needs a bit more time in the oven. Their surveillance app, I know they had it for a while and they took it offline while they worked on it, to their credit, but I still feel it could do with a little bit more time in the oven. But a lot of the Terrasync applications to create those synchronizations between your local apps on your Windows or Mac system towards synchronization with other NASes remotely is kind of a great deal more established thanks to that Terrasync tool. But as you can rightly see, that's another one that's still in beta. Most of the beta apps that I discussed in my video before when I was reviewing tvOS 5, some of them have still yet to leave the beta stage, and I think that Terrasync one, I would rather see them release that fully rather than release it half-baked, but still, that and things like the surveillance app are still not quite there yet. Now, moving away from that list of apps, let's talk about navigating the GUI here. So again, whether you want to manage all the different backups, unsurprisingly, they are in the backup tab. All of those different supported formats, those different platforms, again, cloud, other NAS, USB, local area network, Apple Time Machine, they're all integrated there. And again, if you head over to Terramaster's own site, you can download client tools, but I will say it's a little lackluster. As you can see there, the range of tools available to download. There's the TNAS local area scanning app. I've never really liked that much. You have to give it, obviously, control and access to your local area network, and it will find the NAS. But I don't find it as fully featured as, say, utilizing Advanced IP Scanner. I've always found that to be a better tool overall. It's not a bad app. It's just, although they've improved it over the years, it's still not as good as some of the other apps out there for scanning and finding the NAS and all the tools and configuration of it that you can do on your local device. Same goes with the mobile app. The mobile application for Terramaster, available for iOS and Android. It's good. It's very much a one app for all tool, but it's not the best out there. And I think although they have simplified it and made it a great deal more user-friendly than it was, it could still be better. I will say, when it comes to the security advisor as well, this is another area where I think it's good that they've got it, and I'll talk about another security improvement they've made that I've mentioned on the channel before, but I will highlight in this video in just a moment. But I will say, like, for example, I've scanned the whole NAS here, and some of these things I agree with. Let's zoom in on this just a little bit there. For example, I like that it's telling me to improve my password. I like that it's telling me to enable snapshots because I haven't got it system-wide. Tightening my firewall rules. I've enabled an SSH I've enabled if I do a fresh scan in a moment, but I've not included that here. An HTTPS and a P port there not being default, or are being default and not changed. I like that it's telling me, and it actually goes into a little detail when you dig in, telling you what you're doing wrong and giving advisories, which is good for the less tech versed. But I will say, with security isolation mode, warning me about security isolation mode is a little bit of a misnomer, because you can see isolation mode, which I'll talk about in a moment, is a great tool. Isolation mode, which I've never found in any other NAS, is a one-click button that immediately disables third-party built applications. It also eliminates all remote access, and it basically pulls down all of the shutters on your NAS and cannot be disabled unless you restart your entire NAS. It's a very, very, very useful thing. But I don't like that it's giving me a warning that I'm not using it, because that's quite an extreme kind of worst case scenario button to press. It's good to have it, but I don't think it should be warning me that I've not enabled it in those. And it's little tiny things like that I think don't translate well for a novice user. It's not necessarily bad. I just think it could be translated a little bit better to the user, not in terms of language translation, but presentation. So over again with cloud synchronization, the number of connections you can add, the number of supported platforms is not too shabby, the usual ones that you would expect, and that goes for both block and object level. Multimedia Server allows you to manage and index the data that's on your NAS in terms of photos, video, music, and particularly in conjunction with utilizing the local universal plug and play and DLNA support there. Again, we've talked about Plex snapshots. We can create our snapshot rules, choosing specific folders across the NAS. That includes, as you saw there, including a lot of those iSCSI targeted storage there. The surveillance tool, again, it's beta. We're not going to judge it too harsh, but I will say it does feel like there could be more to be done. I've added a camera to it. Again, the controls and the configuration of the camera is all pretty much what you'd expect. It's quite text heavy. Set up that detection, how much of the camera's detection, how much of the camera's feed is then monitored by the NAS software instead. It's all kind of manageable there. And when we go to the feeds and the camera view and the live view, as you can see here, we've got two feeds. I'll move my hand into camera. As you can see, it is feeding it through there, and if we add multiple cameras, we'll just drag and drop them in. And if you've got the same cameras, you can see there, you can run different routines on that, enable active or manual recording, set some of those schedules, but you can't really do a lot of the bells and whistles stuff that some of the other brands have got on theirs. So for example, the timeline feature here, it would have been nice if they'd integrated timeline into live view as well, because it's quite nice sometimes to be able to not only see a live record of a camera, but also at the same time roll back time to a previous recording there. Again, massive credit to them for creating this, and it's good to have it. I would rather have it than not have it at all, but I wish these two, live view and timeline, were integrated together. Still, nonetheless, I'm not really hearing much in terms of what Terramaster are doing about camera licensing, and while it's in beta, I don't think we're going to hear much about it, but still, nonetheless, it's good to have it. But I'm going to hold off full feedback on that until it's out of beta. But again, good to have it rather than not. General file management on the NAS is actually pretty darn straightforward. You've got the usual file manager there, and again, this is, I'm not going to say the most comprehensive file manager, but at the very least you can manage the files on your NAS via the web browser. Something that I think a lot of you might be surprised is a lot rarer than you think. I think a lot of turnkey NAS solutions, Synology, QNAP, your Asustor, all include this feature, but once you go higher than that, you go towards your unraised, your true NASs, etc., you find out it's actually not that straightforward to remotely manage files and folders without using third-party clients on your Windows or Mac system, or even your Linux servers. So the ability to be able to do all of this, copy and pasting files as well, making shares, again, all of this from the desktop here makes it very straightforward to be able to do all of this stuff in the web browser without using that third-party client tool that you may or may not have locally. Now, again, a lot of this can be managed pretty straightforwardly. We talked about a lot of the backup management on this, and we've got that TerraSync application for the localized streaming of files on your client system across either the local area network or remotely over the internet. You will need those local tools on hand in order to synchronize with them in the most effective way. But at the very least, Terramaster is trying to come up with their own alternative to QNAP's QSync or Synology's Drive application. The same goes for a very basic but surprisingly handy TFM backup tool that allows you to just hands-on select the areas of connected files and folders on the NAS, be they bolted on storage over iSCSI or storage that is remotely accessible, and then just create nice and simple two-way synchronization or one-way backup options, allowing you to just pick where you want the data to go to and from, either for synchronization purposes or backups. And again, going back to it from earlier, you've got the centralized backup tool there for managing those larger scale backup transfers of almost system image level, and I've mentioned earlier on cloud synchronization to bolt on those supported cloud services to the NAS there, all of which are managed either within their individual applications or within the control panel as discussed there. I will say that the AI photo recognition tool, we've already talked about it in a great deal of detail before, but I will be doing a dedicated video on it, largely because although I think it's good, I do think it's another app that could stand to be in the oven just a wee bit longer, and I think it would be unfair to judge it here when elements of it are still beta led. But apart from that, TOS, although it's not perfect, is still better than it has ever been. And although it's still not quite as highfalutin as Synology or QNAP's respective platforms, I will say Terramaster have created a very responsive platform here. And with regard to security, you've still got support of things like two-factor authentication, you've got support of more complex passwords, and in the control panel there, you can play around with a lot of the credentials and access of individual users, as well as set up certain safeguards and provisional security measures in place, such as, number of failed attempts, security certificates and more, which can be applied to the system. And although, as you can see here, if we log in via SSH, let's tap that in, 132, we can dig in a little bit with SSH to find out more about what this system is clocking under the bonnet. I will say that, let's bring that there, let's actually put the password in correctly and look at what I'm doing here on screen. Let's pop that in. And we're able to see that the layout in there is fairly standard. But unfortunately, it did, as my suspicions were raised, those PCIe lanes are indeed Gen 3 times 1 speed there. So the NVMe's are only going to hit 1000 megs each, which may be a little disappointing. But of course, in order to get to that SSH, I had to go ahead and enable SSH connectivity there. And I will say, all of this was disabled by default. A lot of the file services I had to enable manually, and a lot of them aren't enabled by default, which is good. But overall, I think TOS is better than it has ever been. Is it perfect? No, but it is getting closer all the time, and I've got to give them credit for that. But let's head back into the studio and summarize today's review. And here we are, the verdict. Well, unsurprisingly, I like most of what I see about this device. It is not a perfect device by any means, but it's probably my favourite Terramaster I've ever featured here on the channel. Things that I like: number one, I like the new chassis design. I miss the fact that I can't lock these bays, but you never could lock a bay on a Terramaster NAS anyway. I think it's very sleek. I think it's more modern in terms of its design. It's got a much better approach towards cooling and ventilation with those side-assisted cooling panels and that removable side panel, allowing me to access the internal components a great deal easier than previous releases. I'm a big fan of that. Also, I like the fact that it's a single rear fan and not that horrible blocky style that the previous generation Terramasters had that always felt very like early noughties in its aesthetic. I like the fact that two M2 NVMe's are located right there underneath the passive cooling with plenty of space for a heatsink. Not that I think I'm going to need them now that we've identified those lanes as ×1 speed. They're not going to get hot enough for me to be too concerned, but still, nonetheless, nice layout of the components inside this chassis, and definitely this new arrangement of all of those components, although obviously homaging some of their competitors is something to write home about. I like that CPU inside. I like the use of an i3 at this price point when most competitors to include an i3 processor. Normally, they start at $1,000, and I mean start low. This is rocking out with an 8-core i3 and 32GB of memory at $599,699. That's damn fine, and that CPU has got a great little integrated graphics engine for those that take advantage of more complex virtual environments and, of course, Plex Media Server. Also, TOS is better than it has ever been. It's still not going to trouble DSM and QTS, but it's better than it ever has been. And as long as you only want to do the core things, I think it does a great job, and I think it has that isolation mode, the integration of the new centralized backup, synchronization, localized backup tools, and just general system overview tools are all better than they've been. Also, there's M2 NVMEs inside that can be used for both pools and caching. That's what people want, and I'm glad they've integrated it in here. And of course, as mentioned, thanks to that architecture, the fact that this is 8K ready for something like Plex Media Server and otherwise is something good to know. Is it perfect? No. The lack of 10 GBE on this system is baffling to me, and the lack of a USB port there on the front is also baffling to me. Also, because of that lack of 10 GBE, that one factor, I think the price on this is just a pinch too high. The rest of the architecture is great, but the lack of 10 GBE on this, regardless of that internal hardware, I think this could stand to be $30 to $50 cheaper. Also, the mobile and client applications for users just aren't there, and if you're going to access it via the web browser, you're not going to care. But if you're utilizing client tools for Windows, for Mac, for Android, for iOS, there isn't really enough of those for you to have that tailored level of access. And although Terramaster have improved the primary mobile application for both Android and iOS for this device, having an all-in-one app isn't what everybody wants. And some people want a dedicated photo app, a dedicated video app. I get it. Also, I'm not sure about that memory thing. That 32GB of memory when the official manufacturer is 16. I'm not sure how I feel about that, and I think it would, of course, be also remiss not to at least highlight that it has been only a few years since the successful deadbolt ransomware attacks of Terramaster. They were not the only ones impacted. Asustor and QNAP were both impacted by that, but as usual, we will give it a good 5, maybe 7 years before we let them off the hook for that, because it was big enough that I think we do still need to talk about it. But on the whole, on the point, this is still the best Terramaster NAS I've ever had here on the channel, and I would argue right now, at least in terms of hardware, the score to beat when it comes to fully featured NASes. Let's see what the likes of Synology with a DS424 Plus, a DS924 or 925 Plus, a QNAP follow-up to the 464. This is now the score to beat, and this is what I expect from the fully featured tier moving forward. Let's see how the rest of the gang get down. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments if you have. Again, there should be a written review, if not live now, then very, very soon over on NASCompares. If you are looking to get hold of this device, do us a favour and use the links in the description if you intend to go to those shops anyway. Anything you buy from there result in a small commission coming back to myself and Eddie at NASCompares. It's just us here, and it allows us to keep doing what we do. If you need further support, use the free advice section over on NASCompares, the Discord server, or the ask.nascompares forum server over there. If you want to hire me or my colleague Eddie for support and assistance or consultation, there's more options over on Ko-Fi and Patreon. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.